Have you ever felt disposable? Like the world has decided, without consulting you, that your time has passed? Maybe you have an idea in your head, an old spark in your heart, but everything around you insists on whispering that it's not possible now, that it's too late, that the market is already full, that your chance is somewhere in the past. If you've ever felt this way, even if just for a second, this video is for you. They said he was too old to dream, so he created an empire with fried chicken. This isn't just a story about a man and a recipe. It's a story about what happens when someone makes an invisible decision. When, even after hearing more than one thing, 1,000 no's, someone chooses to believe, without applause, without an audience, without any guarantee. Here, every story is a spark. Every video is a safe space to remember who you are, even when the world tries to make you forget. And it's no exaggeration to say that what you're about to discover now may surprise you, because this story doesn't start with fame, fortune, or followers. It starts with rejection, with a 65-year-old man asleep in his car holding a handwritten chicken recipe, trying to convince someone, anyone, that it still had value. And the answer? Always the same. There is too much chicken in this market. You're old. This will never work. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever been ignored for being who you are? Or discredited for trying something outside the norm? You probably know his name. But what no one tells you is what happened before he became a brand, legend, or icon. What few see is what happened in silence. Because before KFC existed, there was a decision made in the dark. And that's where the change lies. It wasn't an investor. It wasn't a mega campaign. He was a choice, a silent bet on one's own value. This video is not about chicken. It's about faith, about turning the game around when no one else believes there is still time, about the type of personal transformation that starts on the inside and one day explodes outwards like an empire. Stay with me until the end, because if today you feel like the world no longer sees your potential, this story will remind you of what still lives inside you. And more than that, it will show you how visible results always come from invisible decisions, how failure can be just the beginning, and how a choice made at rock bottom can indeed change everything. Now come back in time with me. Let's find out together what was happening in Harlan Sanders' life before he became the famous Colonel. He was not a precocious genius. He was not a promising young man. He was not the kind of man you would point to on the street and say, "There goes someone destined for success." In fact, he was the opposite of that. An ordinary man, with a story full of twists and turns, stumbles and silences. But there was something about him that the world couldn't see, and perhaps even he himself couldn't see completely. The willingness to keep going, even when it seemed ridiculous to do so. Think about it. 1,000 rejections, 1,000 closed doors, 1,000 looks that said without words, "This is not for you." And yet, he followed. That's why this story touches so deeply. Because it's not just his, it belongs to everyone who has ever felt like they were too late. To anyone who has ever had an idea shelved. To anyone who has heard that they no longer have space or time. To anyone who is trying to get on their feet in a world that shouts hurry and discards those who don't fit. If this topic makes sense to you, leave a comment below with what has touched you the most so far. Maybe you're experiencing your own 1,000th Sanosan, or maybe you've already made that invisible decision not to stop. Share it. Sometimes what you write might be exactly what someone needed to read today, and if this kind of story touches you, if it helps you remember your worth, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It may seem like just a click, but for those who are on this side, creating with their hearts, it makes all the difference. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Because in the end, what we are building here is more than videos. It is a place where stories become mirrors, where we find ourselves in each other's paths and understand that there is still time. Now, imagine this man with me, driving along the roads from city to city, knocking on doors with a chicken recipe, and a silent faith that someone, just one, would see what he saw. Let's enter this moment together. He was 65 years old. While many were already talking about rest, routine, or conformity, he carried in his eyes the weariness of someone who had not yet been heard. He lived on a minimum pension, enough to keep his body going, but not his soul. That restless, stubborn soul that still insisted on saying, "It's not over." But the world seemed to have made up its mind for him. No one wanted to hear about yet another secret source. There was no glamour to his proposal. It was just chicken, just another old man with an idea, just another invisible face in a crowded marketplace. It was at this time that he started sleeping in the car. Not because of a lifestyle, but because he had no other option. The back seat became a bed. The steering wheel became a support for his tired elbows. Every cold morning became a silent conversation between him and doubt. Does it still make sense to try? More than 1,000 times, he knocked on doors. Restaurants, cafes, small businesses. He presented his recipe as if offering a piece of his own history. But what he always got back was the same look: disinterest, contempt, haste. "There's too much chicken in this market," they said. "You should be resting, not insisting." In other words, they were saying, "You don't matter anymore." This is the part of the journey that no one wants to experience. The behind-the-scenes story that successful books skip. Because it hurts. Because it exposes a hidden truth. Failure, when added to age, becomes silence. And the silence of invisibility is one of the cruelest there is. It is in this place, with no fame, no guarantees, no return, that most people give up. And those who give up here are not weak, they are human. But what separates the stories we remember from the ones that disappear is what happens exactly at this point. When everything says stop, and yet something inside you says go one more time. This feeling of having missed the right time, of having fallen behind, is one of the most common pains in stories of real overcoming. Because society shapes success with an expiration date, there is a silent belief that if you haven't won by a certain age, maybe you won't win again. And that is a lie. A cruel lie, but repeated so many times that it starts to seem true. His rock bottom wasn't just financial. It was emotional, existential. It was the feeling that his life had passed him by and left no mark. And yet, there he was, with a crumpled prescription in his hands, a tired look in his eyes, but an attitude that said, "I still believe in myself." It is at this point in the journey that transformation begins, not with fireworks or an audience, but with an invisible decision, the one that no one sees but that changes everything. It is when you decide to continue, not because the world applauds you, but because you can no longer bear to give up. And this is perhaps the most powerful turning point that anyone can experience. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding what comes after this silent choice is what separates those who dream from those who build. That's when the journey changes direction. Not because the world has changed, but because you transformed first. Comment here. I'm on this journey too, if any part of this struck you differently. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what comes after rock bottom is not a leap, nor an immediate miracle. It is a silent moment, almost invisible to the eyes of those who look from the outside. An internal curve in the journey. There is no audience, no epic music. Just you and the decision not to give up on yourself. And that is exactly what happened to Harlan Sanders. He understood, after so many no's, that what he was offering was not just fried chicken, it was a story. An entire life compressed into a recipe. It was respect for everything he had ever experienced. Every seasoning, every measurement, every detail had an emotional weight. And it was at that point that something changed. He stopped asking for permission and started taking a stand. He stopped seeking acceptance and started defending his own truth. It was at that moment that a silent promise emerged, made by him to himself. If I hear 1,000 more no's, I'll still keep going. It was no longer about external acceptance. It was about an identity that he finally chose to embrace, one that did not depend on age, the market, or the opinions of others. And this, perhaps, was the most revolutionary move of his life: transform pain into positioning. The old worn suit was traded in for an iconic white suit. The simple look was fleshed out with a trimmed beard, glasses, and a black bow tie. This wasn't vanity. This was branding, a visual expression of an internal decision. This was him telling the world, "I know who I am, and I'm going to show that before anyone tries to define me again. This part of the story often goes unnoticed by those who only see the final success. But behind the scenes of every journey, there is an intimate, non-transferable choice that redefines everything. It's not about talent. It's not about luck. It's about presence. About assuming with firmness and conviction that you're still there, and that you're not going to keep quiet anymore, even if no one is listening yet. This kind of transformation has no announcement. It doesn't arrive with fanfare, it arrives in silence. In a parked car, on a blank sheet of paper, in a suit of clothing you wear like armor. It arrives in the phrase you say to yourself when no one else believes you. I will continue. And maybe you are living exactly that moment right now. Maybe you are tired, hurt, disbelieving, but with an inner voice that has not yet silenced. Maybe you are waiting for the right signal to continue. What if it is this one? What if you are exactly at the point of the curve? The one where invisible decisions shape the results that the world is yet to see. This is where the real turning point begins, because there is no external achievement that is not first born as an internal determination. And when you understand this, everything changes. Your outlook changes, your posture changes, your fear shifts. You stop seeking approval, and you start making an impact, not by shouting louder, but by finally speaking with the right voice. What Harlan did at that moment was not to create a brand. He was to gather courage. He was to embody the character that the world did not yet know, but that already existed within him. And that was what the world responded to. Not to the chicken, but to the conviction of someone who finally decided to show up. Comment here. That makes sense to me, if some part of this silent turn also echoes within you. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when an invisible decision is consistently upheld, the world begins little by little to respond. At first, still with resistance, still with distrust. But the energy changes, the frequency changes, and where there were previously closed doors, gaps begin to appear. A first opportunity, a first yes. That's what happened to Harlan. After more than 1,000 ignored attempts, a restaurant finally agreed to test his recipe. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-grabbing. It was a small, almost imperceptible step on the roadmap to success. But there, in that seemingly simple gesture, was the validation he had been waiting for decades. Not just of his recipe, but of his career. This is the point at which the invisible begins to become visible. When what existed only in faith, in the mind and in the heart, begins to materialize in reality. The internal transformation begins to have an external reflection. And if there is a hidden truth in this journey, it is this. The world takes time to see what you already know about yourself, but it sees. Eventually, it sees. After the first restaurant came the second, then the third. And what seemed like an outdated idea, something from an insistent old man, began to take shape, form, and impact. Harlan didn't change the essence, he just gave it continuity. And this is one of the greatest lessons in mentality that this story teaches. When something comes from your truth, you don't need to reinvent it all the time. You just need to sustain it. Over time, the man in the car became the man on the billboards. At 75, his image was plastered all over cities, not for marketing purposes, but for history. Because people weren't just buying chicken, they were connecting with a symbol. A figure who, even when ignored, even when discredited, insisted on existing with dignity. And here comes something profound about recognition. It may come late, it may not be immediate, but when it comes cleanly, built on persistence, it carries an almost indestructible force, because it does not depend on fads. It does not come from virality. It comes on purpose. It's easy to look at this part of his journey and romanticize it. Talk about success, authority, and fame. But what matters most here is not the results themselves, but what they represent. Because every restaurant that started selling his chicken was, in fact, a reflection of the decision he made back then in the dark, the one that no one applauded, the one that seemed crazy, the one that only he knew he was making. And perhaps this is what we need to remember more often. The fruits are visible, but the roots always spring from the invisible. True authority does not come from numbers. It comes from who you choose to Be even when no one is looking. And Haaland, even with every reason to stop, chose to continue. And it was this choice that made him memorable. His face became a brand. The brand became a legacy. And the phrase that has remained in the memory of time accurately sums up everything he experienced. You only fail when you give up. Comment here. This is about me too. If this part of the story brought to light some part of you that you had been forgetting. And now I want you to turn your attention to yourself. No rush, no distractions. Just you and this question that perhaps no one has asked with such depth. What would you do if no one believed in your dreams, not in theory, not as a nice movie idea, but in practice, in reality? What if the people closest to you said it wasn't worth it? What if you heard that it was too late, that there were already too many people trying, that your voice wasn't that relevant? What would happen to your dream in that scenario? Because in the end, Colonel Sanders' story may be unique in its details, but it is universal in its pain. And that is what makes it so powerful. It touches on that point that almost no one admits out loud. The fear of trying again, the tiredness of insisting, the doubt that grows when we don't see results. But it also touches on that stubborn hope that refuses to die. The one that insists on whispering, even after so many no's, go one more time. How many times have you lost faith in yourself just because someone made you feel small? How many projects have you shelved because you thought the right time had passed? How many versions of yourself were lost along the way because fear spoke louder than faith? It is at this point that his story stops being about chicken and starts being about courage. Not the kind of courage that shouts, the other kind, the kind that acts in silence, that drives miles with an idea in hand, that knocks on doors even. Though he knows most of them will close, that wears a white suit not to impress but to say, I'm here, I exist, and I believe in myself even if you don't believe in me yet. Now tell me, what would your white suit be? What version of you is still waiting for permission to appear? What if you already had everything you needed, but were just putting it off because you were waiting for someone to validate what only you can validate? You don't need 1 million followers, or an investor, or a magic sign. What you need perhaps is a moment like this, a shortcut between who you are today and who you can become if you have the courage to decide. Because that's what changes everything. A decision. Invisible, solitary, but incredibly powerful. Can you remember a time when you gave up on something that still made you shine inside? Can you identify which part of you is still fighting to be heard? Because these questions are not rhetorical. They are invitations for you to look at yourself with more compassion, with more firmness, and with more truth. Sanders' journey didn't start when he became successful. It started when he said, try to yourself, for the 1,000th time, even though you have 1,000 reasons to say no. And this kind of choice is available to you now, not tomorrow. Not when everything is more favorable, now, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of bills, in the midst of doubts. You don't need the world to understand your worth right now. You just need to understand and bank on it and decide, because sometimes that's all it takes, a silent choice in the midst of confusion, a spark of clarity that says, I won't abandon myself again. And when you do this, even if no one sees it, the universe organizes itself, because invisible decisions create profound movements, and sooner or later, the world begins to see what if that's exactly what's missing right now? A reminder of what you carry, a spark of everything you can still be. So tell me, does this make sense to you? Write in the comments, I will not abandon myself again. Because sometimes, all we need is to admit it out loud. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to a part of you that may have been quiet for a while. And if this content touched you in some way, if it reminded you of something important about yourself, then it's worth sticking around. We've created this space for that, for those who want to grow without having to shout, for those who carry a silent truth and just need a place where it makes sense. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That way you can continue following stories that are not only inspirational, but also turning points. And if you felt this connection until the end, leave a comment. I'm with you until the end. This shows me that this message has found its place. Oh, and if this video made sense to you, leaving a like helps more than it seems. It's like saying, I'm here and this affected me too. There is a video here that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The next story may be even more similar to yours than you imagine.